Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Undersecretary, for being here. As Congress is currently debating how to provide additional military resources to the Ukraine, and it seems quite possible the U.S. military and financial support for Ukraine will continue to be a topic of discussion over an extended period of time. Is it your assessment and that of the DOD that the Ukraine needs additional assistance and needs it as soon as possible?
It is. The fight's ongoing, and so whatever we can get them in the very near future, it could be hugely important to them.
I agree wholeheartedly. Additionally, there are concerns that proposing a defense budget that is effectively a cut to our defense budget sends a signal to our adversaries, especially Russia during the current invasion of the Ukraine, that we plan to be less robust on national security. This also sends a signal to our allies that we may not be able to support them in times of need. What are the DOD plans to replenish our European partners' defense systems since they've sent a bulk of theirs to the Ukraine? How is the United States prepared to bolster, there's another element of the question, the same question, bolster Sweden and Finland's defenses if those countries decide to enter NATO or be accepted in NATO? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me address the second part first. I think we, the Defense Department, and I believe the administration would be very supportive of Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO, and I personally would expect that this may well be on the agenda for the late June summit, that it could be ready by then. I think that would be a welcome development. And one of the reasons it would be welcome is that they are very capable already and shouldn't need a lot of help from us to be contributing to the team immediately. Should they desire to join the team, I believe they'd be welcomed as very capable partners without requiring a lot of assistance from us. It probably would lead to discussions about interoperability and maybe shared industrial-based use, but not needing a lot of direct help from us. Your first question about other countries that have also contributed equipment to Ukraine, I think that's going to have to be a case-by-case basis. So, I mean, just to take, I don't mean this to be an extreme-sounding example, but if one person or one country is sort of cleaning out their attic of things that they never used and aren't going to miss, and aren't going to really ask them to, they're not digging very deep, and another country is maybe is more threatened by Russia and is digging deeply into things that they really need replenished. I think you can imagine those are pretty different cases as to whether or not it should be on us and the American taxpayer to refill everybody's coffers, or I think more of a case-by-case basis would be more appropriate.
So I hope it's not the case, or is it that some are just emptying out their attics and their weaponry that is not worthwhile to the Ukraine? Is that the case?
I only posit that as an example that some people are giving things that are less important to them than others, and are maybe less on the front lines than others.
Great. Okay.
Every contribution is important to the Ukrainians.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
I'm sorry, gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, thanks for being here and taking the time. I kind of want to delve a little bit into defense contracting a little bit. Obviously, we know how important defense contracting is to DOD, our entire military apparatus, especially when it comes to building and maintaining ships and equipment for our men and women. But we also do have to acknowledge it appears that there have been real issues associated with prolonged timelines for maintenance and or new equipment to actually be put into service. When you guys are going through your cost projections and the budget, does DOD take into account the additional costs associated with potentially prolonged projects? Because in any contract that ever exists, the longer it takes to execute, typically the more expensive it becomes. So does DOD take into account for that in its budget?
That's a great question. I would say probably not enough in that when we know that a contract is going to take X amount of time to execute and for the service or the good to be performed and delivered, that amount of time is built into the cost estimate. So if you know something's going to take 2 years, you're going to have a different inflation assumption, a different cost assumption than something that's going to deliver much more quickly. What I think we probably don't do well, even though I said that we're used to continuing resolutions and a pattern of delayed budgeting in terms of knowing that we're not going to be able to enter into contracts in the first quarter of a fiscal year, I don't know that we have changed our cost estimating to account for this pattern of delays as well as we could have.
Real quick follow-up to that. I mean, is there something that you believe, obviously outside of, consistent budgeting on Capitol Hill, which, by the way, I would agree with you on. That's something that Capitol Hill should be doing, is consistent budgeting. But is there anything outside of that the administration is starting to look at with respect to making sure that our contracts actually, that they're actually executed on time, and that we actually are doing everything we can with respect to a lot of equipment, a lot of ships that are just sitting in dry dock waiting for maintenance to be completed?
Yeah, those are probably the hardest examples, because you have, when you get into something as complicated as a ship and you maybe find different corrosion than you expected, and or you have issues with your workforce, as been a real big issue on the ship side, is getting the skilled workers in those particular trades when you need them, given the the tight labor market. I don't know that we have a systematic report for you. But when the issues that we're aware of, and particularly on the ship side, we do have attempts to address either the infrastructure or the workforce or both. But if you're asking about contracting writ large, I would have to probably get you an answer for the record from our acquisition and contracting community.
Yeah, I would appreciate
to a
that.
broader
The
set
only
of-
reason why and I don't mean to shut you down. I know what you're saying is important, but I'm also running out of time. I want to get somewhere else. But I would appreciate a more detailed answer with respect to that. One thing I do want to highlight in our discussion right now is really how important inflation and labor is to the functioning, not just of DOD, but our economy overall. I was having a conversation with members of one of my city councils, and they were trying to address so many issues affecting their city, but so many of those are impacted by fiscal policy and monetary policy out of Washington, specifically with inflation and how that does impact labor markets. So obviously you guys are feeling that at DOD as well. I think it's important that the administration takes a lot of their future fiscal and monetary decisions into account of how broad and widespread those impacts are when you're trying to do simple things like, finish a ship on time, get equipment out where it needs to be, build an affordable housing project, or even private contractors building single-family homes. It is universal, the destructive impacts of inflation and bad fiscal policy. I do want to switch gears real quick, and we're running out of time. The president made a statement the other day that he wants the military to essentially be all electric and to go green. Let's just be perfectly honest. Is it even possible for the military to do that, one? And then number two, can the United States military completely survive on wind, solar, and a quote-unquote green renewable energy matrix?
I appreciate your on inflation. I will say that, yeah, that is something that we are very sensitive to as well. Of course, we are subject to all the same pressures and all the same factors in terms of labor prices and getting skilled workers that you describe. On vehicles and airplanes, again, airplanes are what consume the vast majority of the energy that DOD consumes. I don't think that there's any immediate prospect of us having a fundamentally different type of airplanes that we're using, whether they're manned or unmanned. They're going to still rely on the same type of fuels for the foreseeable future. So I don't think that we really should be focusing on whether, the non-tactical side is much easier to work with in terms of getting that to be more electrified. The combat vehicles, the combat side is going to be a much longer-term prospect if it's possible.
Mr. Chairman, if you give me leeway, a real brief follow-up to that, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, is it possible to fly an F-16 or an F-35 on biofuels?
I'm not aware that we've had biofuels experiments on aircraft the way that we have on ships, so I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was chairing a committee in Judiciary, and thank you for your courtesies. Secretary McCord, thank you for the time that you've given us. Let me quickly go to personnel matters, and I have a boatload of questions, and so your typical defense pithiness would be greatly appreciated. Again, thank you for your service in the service of so many men and women in the United States military. Just coming back from Ukraine, I was with the 82nd Airborne, all ready and serving, and then previously was with the United States Army as well on the Belarus-Lithuania border. So thank you so very much, and I know our men and women are around the world. Let me focus on the question of the quality of life. What wars have been somewhat behind us. What kind of investment are you making in PTSD, the issues dealing with women's health? I've been an advocate for fighting against triple negative breast cancer. I'd like to see that program expanded. And then personnel dollars, in terms of increased salary and housing. If I could just take that package, because I want to go on to something else, but I'm interested in the quality of life issues that you deal with the men and women in the United States military.
Yes, in the interest of time, we will get you an answer for the record on the PTSD and some of the particular issues in the health budget that you mentioned, rather than me trying to guess at them without all the facts at my fingertips. I'm sorry, Congressman, I can't hear you right now.
Ms. Jackson-Lee, are you?
Yes. Can you generally, Secretary McCord, give a general commitment to these quality of life issues and making sure funding in your budget is there?
Absolutely. Secretary Austin has a huge focus on taking care of our people. He talks about it with us all the time, as it's a very high priority of his.
Great. Let me ask you about the outcomes of a study assessment program dealing with an officer's fitness for command. Any future steps with the DOD and the Army might be taken to implement a qualitative interview process in the BCAP?
I will say that that's outside my area of expertise, but I have heard the Army describe what they're trying to do to make sure that they make the best possible selections in terms of fitness for command. But I would have to get you an answer from the Army on the status of that program in more detail. I am familiar with it, and I have heard Army leadership discuss it.
All right, I will focus on the DOD has requested $479 million to implement the 80+ recommendations from the review dealing with the sexual assault. In requesting those dollars, what will be the oversight to make sure that these dollars are implemented properly across the gamut of the jurisdiction of the Pentagon and the various military branches?
Thank you. The primary oversight that I believe you will see in that area is the Deputy Secretary Hicks has something called a Defense Workforce Council, which is meant to sort of provide the same kind of oversight that we often see on weapons programs and investments, to have the same oversight of our personnel-related programs. That is the venue that would be vetting our efforts on sexual assault prevention. In addition to the action officers, of course, at lower levels that are actually running the programs, but the Deputy Secretary would probably be the primary oversight of that.
What, well, let me, overall defense budget comes in many different forms. Want to make sure that there is going to be strong focus on the infrastructure that the United States military bases, housing, and that the Secretary and the Defense Department will have a focus on that. Let me just give you two questions so that you can answer. That's the number one. And secondarily, as I indicated, many of us have been to the border dealing with the despotic violence that President Putin is exhibiting against innocent human beings. The question is, we have given unanimous consent. The president has offered some additional huge dollars coming from the Defense Department for Ukraine in terms of weaponry. And do you have a projected schedule of continuing that, or those particular ones that have just been issued in the last, say, 48 hours, 72 hours, when their time would be reaching into the region?
Yes, thank you for that question. In recent, in the last week or two, the drawdown, as they're so-called, the Presidential Drawdown Authority packages, once approved by the Secretary and the President and announced, have been on airplanes on their way to Europe within about 48 hours. So from the time these decisions are made, the equipment is moving very rapidly. There is no higher priority, I think, of General Milley and Secretary Austin than keeping an eye on exactly what is flowing. And not only is it on an airplane, is it on a ship, has it arrived in Europe, but is it across the border into the hands of Ukrainians? So that is being tracked on a daily basis at very senior levels. We have used, as of this week, we will probably have used all the authority that Congress gave us for additional drawdown, and we anticipate coming back to Congress in the coming days to get more authority to continue to help the Ukrainians.
I hope in the course of that, you all will have a classified briefing for members of Congress, so that would add to their understanding. Our constituents have been very supportive, but I know our overall perspective is that we want peace, so we know where we are in this raging, vicious war against Ukraine. And so we've got to provide defense as we discuss ways of solution. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary McCord, you didn't, I know it's ended, but very quickly, the infrastructure.
Gentlewoman's time's expired. You can submit a question for the record. But
well, thank you. If you can answer the one about the repair, thank you. I yield back.
All right. Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Undersecretary, thank you for being here. And as you're aware, Mr. Secretary, there are 4 combat readiness training centers in the United States. I have the honor and privilege of representing one of those in Savannah, Georgia. And it is proposed under this budget to be closed. Now, aside from the lunacy, and I will refer to it as lunacy, of considering closing any combat training center, combat readiness training center, at this point in world history where we could potentially be on the brink of World War III is just insane to me, especially when you take into consideration that the Savannah facility is the most utilized and the most efficient of any of the 4 combat readiness training centers here in America. Not only that, but you know, the most frustrating thing, it's all frustrating, but another frustrating part of this is the fact that 2 years ago, in 2019, I should say, in 2019, there was $24 million allocated to build a new hangar for that facility. Now that hangar is under construction right now. The ribbon cutting on it is slated to happen in September. I've been invited and I look forward to being there. $24 million, it should be completed by then and we'll have the ribbon cutting on it. And then it is slated to be closed in April of 2023. Not only that, but the facility also, about 3 weeks ago, had $1.2 million worth of computer equipment installed there. Computer equipment that's not available anywhere else in the country at any of the other combat readiness training facilities. That $1.2 million worth of computer equipment that was installed, again, in April of 2023 is going to be gone to waste. No wonder taxpayers get so upset about wasteful spending in the federal government. Now, how important is that training center? Every F-22 pilot over the last 2 years has been trained at that facility. I just have to ask you, Mr. Secretary, of what is more important to our readiness and ability to counter threats across the world like Russia and China? Climate and social spending or an actual military asset like the Savannah Combat Readiness Training Center?
Mr. Carter, it's clear that you know much more about this particular training center than I do, so I'm not going to offer you an explanation that is not as well informed as your question is. I'm going to have to get with my colleagues for the record of what was the rationale on capacity or other grounds for this particular proposal.
But you can understand, particularly in the environment, the world environment that we're in. We all know what's going on. We see it every day on TV, on social media. We've got a front row seat to a war that's going on here that could potentially lead us into World War III. I just finished reading a book about World War II, The Splendid and the Vile by Eric Larson. And you know that when Germany invaded Great Britain, they never intended to bomb London. It was actually a mistake made by one of the generals, one of the Nazi generals. Can you imagine what a mistake an errant missile would do if it were to hit a NATO country right now? We'd be in World War III. And yet we're talking about a budget that recommends closing a combat readiness training center, the most efficient, the most utilized that we have here, where we just about to complete a $24 million hangar, where we just installed $1.2 million in computer equipment. And yet this budget includes billions of dollars to go toward climate change. Why isn't that money being used to keep these facilities open?
Mr. Carter, I agree that we owe you an explanation of the proposal on the CRTC that you're describing. I'm not familiar with the details enough myself.
Obviously, this is very upsetting. It's upsetting for me, it's upsetting for my constituents, it's upsetting for Americans to even think that we would even consider this. I look forward to your response, Mr. Secretary, and I hope that you will be able to provide me with that and provide some kind of explanation and consider doing away with some of these climate change initiatives and keeping this much-needed facility open. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I now yield myself 10 minutes. You only have to deal with me now, Undersecretary. I have kind of a rhetorical question, but I'm going to ask it. Are you aware of any time when the Department of Defense has requested a budget that was less money than they thought they needed?
I'm not.
And I think it's interesting to have this discussion because we're hearing from a lot of people that seem to be questioning whether we are providing enough money for defense, and that's always certainly a valid question. We always have to ask that. Armed Services has to ask that as well. But the experts are at the Pentagon, the people who actually have the responsibility for defending the country, and I assume that they're not going to be derelict in their duties since they've given their life for the defense of their careers for the defense of this country, and they're not going to ask for less money than they think will be adequate to defend the country. And the question I have is, we can argue about percentages, we can argue about inflation, we can argue about declassifying some equipment, reducing the number of service members. But can you tell us today that with this budget, we have not in any way diminished our capacity to defend the United States?
Chairman, I would say that far from it, we feel like we have made progress, we are making progress, would make progress in this budget across the board on any number of fronts, to keeping the triad strong and modern and capable, to space resilience, to the quality of our people. What I would say that our budget does not do, no budget can do, is reduce all risk, eliminate all risk. That's not the realistic standard by which this department leadership or any department leadership can present a budget to you that we've now eliminated all security risks in the United States. So there will always be someone who could say, I could use more here for X. I think, it would be helpful, but in terms of balancing and addressing our risk across not only the national security space, but in the whole of government framework, as well as the defense-specific framework, we feel like we have a very strong budget that does everything that Secretary Austin told the President we needed to accomplish, and the President gave Secretary what he asked for.
Thank you for that answer. Now, I know you don't want to ask the $3.1 billion climate change question again, since it's been asked by virtually every member of the Republican side, but can you give us some examples of how climate change has already impacted the military?
Yes, sir. The primary things that we look at are our own our own installations, especially those on the coast, have suffered significant financial impact of storm damage in recent years, and hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars have gone to repair extreme weather damage at places like Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. More importantly, perhaps, as we look out into the future, is climate change is going to instigate societal change, societal conflict, population migration, scarce resources, food problems, and those generate conflict. Those are at least our potential to generate conflict, and that's going to change where we might be called on to intervene, what we might be called on to do. So that is the other aspect, I think, in terms of what it does to the world security situation when you inject that kind of new instability into the world is to climate change, that not everybody in the world can move, right, to accommodate climate change, so it's going to create conflict.
You anticipated another part of the question, but I'm going to ask a third part. Is there anybody you know of in DOD, going back through the Trump administration, the Obama administration, go back pretty far, at least 10, 15 years, who doesn't think that climate change poses a significant risk to the U.S. military?
I have not heard any senior civilian or military leader say that the issue is not there.
Right. Thank you. I want to move on to the question of the audit. And, I think everybody would like to see the Pentagon have a comprehensive, clean audit every year. But it seems to me, having been involved in the private sector with some audits over the years, that auditing $700+ billion is not something that is easily done, no matter how well-intentioned the leadership of the Pentagon and the auditors would be. So this is kind of one of those, let us help you, help us help you questions, and that is, are we expecting too much out of when we talk about an audit of the Pentagon, or is there a way we can require it to be done that's helpful but not as difficult to do? Because it seems to me that if you're using normal standards for an audit where you have to take inventory of every bullet and every piece of equipment that you have, and do appraisals of real estate values and all of the things that you would normally do, I don't know how in the world you could get it done on a timely basis.
Chairman, thank you for that question. I would say that I understand why it's expected of us. It's the law in the CFO Act. Other agencies do it, and it's a reasonable expectation of we should be able to do it too, despite our size and complexity. As you know, if we were our own country, our budget would put us in about the 30th country biggest in the world in terms of GDP, so we're an enormous operation, and we not only have to audit a $700 billion annual budget, we have $3 trillion in assets, and it's really on the balance sheet side that there's one thing that I think would be that we could get there much faster with the least damage to the public interest would be if we didn't have to do the balance sheet part of the audit, but we're doing the other parts of an audit, because valuing all our property has been an enormous challenge for us. Whereas, for example, 40% of our budget approximately is on the people side, is pay and benefits of our troops. We have clean opinions on all the processes that pay our military, pay our civilians, pay our retirees, which is exactly what my boss, the secretary, would want, taking care of people. We are not messing that up. But on the trillions of dollars of assets that we have, accounting for it and valuing it is where we're struggling, as well as on the IT systems. But we should not be getting a pass on the IT system side, because as we see every day with the increasing degree of cyber threats, that if you don't have secure systems, you have other problems besides not passing the audit, right? So that is something where I think we definitely have a lot of work to do that we need to do. But on what I would call the balance sheet side, I'm not sure that the payoff for the taxpayers is really there, because if I can take one more minute on this, I know you know this, but it's easy to maybe for not everyone to understand it, that passing a financial audit means your obligations on the financial side are being matched with all your contracting decisions. It doesn't mean that the airplane that you bought was the right airplane, that it performs well, that you paid a fair price for it. There's any number of things that people are rightly concerned about in terms of that might be called waste or fraud or poor use of money. passing an audit does not prevent and is not designed to prevent. It's matching up your numbers, but it still doesn't guarantee that you made wise decisions. And I know you know that, but that is just the other caveat I make. It is still worth doing, and it is the law. But I think again on the balance sheet side, I'm not sure that people at the end of the day will find the payoff is really there.
I appreciate that answer. One quick question before I go. I may have asked you this before, but I'm not. I remember meeting with a group of from the War College, and one of the things I asked them was, do you all think a lot about, this is probably 3 years ago, it was before pre-pandemic because they were in the office, and so do you all think a lot about how artificial intelligence is affecting the military and will? And their eyes all opened up, and one of them said, we talk about it all the time. I don't think there will ever be a strategic decision or tactical decision on a battlefield made again without artificial intelligence. And I asked the question because I'm curious as to how much money is being spent on researching how artificial intelligence can enhance our military operations and whether that's a high priority.
It is a high priority. In terms of how much is in the budget, it's a hard question to answer because like software, it's not in everything yet, but it's in many things and it's getting in more programs. It's part of more programs every day. I would say something that we kind of put our arms around, think about the $2 billion range right now, but the importance is growing rapidly. I would say along with quantum computing, it is one of two sort of foundational technological changes that we're looking in the national security world, not just the defense world, but the national security world. I think you are correct that man-machine teaming is already here and is going to grow. I know people sometimes focus on something that's entirely autonomous. We are not going to be quick to take the person out of the loop, I think, in terms of, especially in terms of the use of lethal force. But the man-machine teaming and the speed of decision-making, it's already here and it's growing. It is a huge interest item of our Deputy Secretary, who serves as our COO, basically. And there are a number of efforts that we've had to increase the use of AI out in the combatant commands, where we're sort of processing in real time current operations, but also on the back end in the Pentagon in terms of decision-making processes. So we're looking at sort of both the business side and the operational side of AI, and she has created a new office, the Chief Digital and AI Office, to bring together some of these areas that were sort of in different places in terms of a focus on AI and how it affects our abilities. Again, the secretary, obviously is focused on this too, but the Deputy Secretary particularly has this sort of for an action item under the Secretary as to how we can really be much more agile than we are today in terms of information flows. I think there are areas where we have incredible situational awareness and real-time awareness, but AI is just increasing the need to speed your decision making, and that is something that we're very focused on, how to get better at that, because it is clearly foundational for the future.
Great. Well, I appreciate that answer. My time has expired. So I thank you again for coming before the committee today to present the President's DOD budget, and appreciate your responses. And if there's no further business, this hearing is adjourned.